In the dead of night, on November 8, 1942, the Axis defenders of Arzew, Algeria stared out into the darkness, completely unaware that a phantom force was already scaling the sheer cliffs beneath their massive coastal guns. When the assault finally hit, it struck with a paralyzing, silent violence. The German and Vichy French commanders were entirely baffled. The attackers possessed the unmistakable, ruthless precision of elite British commandos. Yet when the smoke cleared, the men stepping over the bodies of the fallen defenders were wearing American uniforms. It was a tactical nightmare for the Axis High Command, a localized slaughter that paved the way for the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point. But this devastating, coordinated shock assault was no accident. It was the bloody climax of a desperate, historically unprecedented transatlantic gamble. What happened next shocked the world and forever altered the blueprint of modern special operations. How did two radically different armies, separated by an ocean and conflicting military doctrines, learn to strike from the shadows as a single, terrifying weapon?
In the sweltering, desperate summer of 1942, the global strategic map presented a deeply terrifying reality for the Allied powers. The Axis war machine had seemingly mastered the art of lightning conquests, stretching its iron dominion from the freezing shores of the Baltic Sea to the scorching dunes of the Sahara. In the Mediterranean theater, General Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa was aggressively driving eastward, threatening to shatter the British Eighth Army, seize the vital Suez Canal, and effectively cut the arterial lifeline of the British Empire. To relieve this suffocating pressure and establish a crucial foothold from which to eventually strike at the soft underbelly of Europe, American and British high commands conceived an audacious, highly perilous plan, Operation Torch. This would be a massive, unprecedented amphibious invasion of French North Africa, targeting the heavily defended coastlines of Morocco and Algeria. However, launching the largest seaborne assault in military history against deeply entrenched coastal fortresses presented a nightmare scenario for Allied planners. They faced hundreds of miles of hostile shoreline, bristling with heavy artillery, hidden machine gun nests, and thousands of Vichy French troops whose loyalties remained dangerously unpredictable. To penetrate such formidable coastal defenses without suffering catastrophic, invasion-ending casualties on the beaches, the Allies required a highly specialized surgical instrument. For the British, this capability had already been meticulously forged in the dark, isolated years following the humiliating evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, demanding a mechanism to strike back at a seemingly invincible enemy, had explicitly authorized the creation of the Commandos. Under the aggressive, innovative direction of Lord Louis Mountbatten and his combined operations headquarters, these fiercely independent raiding forces had spent 2 years perfecting the ruthless, bloody art of the amphibious shock assault. Through daring, nocturnal raids along the jagged coastlines of occupied Norway and France, the British commandos had developed a highly distinct, lethal doctrine. They eschewed heavy supply lines and prolonged engagements, relying instead on absolute stealth, brutal hand-to-hand combat, rapid demolitions, and sudden extraction. They were undisputed masters of the hit-and-run, capable of neutralizing heavy coastal batteries and severing communication networks before the enemy even realized an attack had commenced. Across the Atlantic, however, the United States military faced a glaring institutional deficiency. Following the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the American war machine was undergoing an explosive, unprecedented expansion, drafting millions of men into service. Yet this rapidly swelling army was entirely conventional in its design and philosophy. American military doctrine in 1942 was fundamentally built upon the concepts of overwhelming mass, continuous logistical support, and sustained heavy firepower. The United States possessed absolutely no equivalent to the British Commandos. There was no dedicated cadre of highly trained pathfinders or elite raiders capable of spearheading a complex amphibious invasion in the dark. American field commanders, accustomed to the rigid structure of massed infantry battalions supported by deafening artillery barrages, were deeply suspicious of specialized elite units, viewing them as a dangerous drain on the top-tier manpower of regular combat divisions. But as the strategic realities of Operation Torch loomed closer, the grim truth became unavoidable. The sprawling, inexperienced American infantry divisions preparing to storm North Africa were entirely ill-equipped to silence the heavy coastal guns waiting for them in the shadows.
The impending slaughter on the beaches of Algeria demanded an immediate, radical solution. United States Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall recognized that building a specialized amphibious raiding force from scratch using unproven American training doctrines would take precious years the Allies simply did not have. The solution, proposed by his brilliant and pragmatic liaison to British Combined Operations, Major General Lucian Truscott, was historically unprecedented. Truscott argued that the United States must actively swallow its institutional pride, bypass its own rigid training bureaucracy, and tap directly into the hard-won, bloody expertise of the British military. He proposed the immediate activation of an American volunteer unit to be named the Rangers, who would be entirely handed over to the British Commandos for specialized instruction. It was a staggering proposition, taking the finest, most physically capable soldiers the American Army could produce and submitting them to the absolute authority, foreign doctrine, and punishing tactical standards of an allied nation. The gravity of Truscott's proposal was not lost on General Marshall, who recognized that the looming invasion of North Africa hinged entirely on securing the coastal ports. He swiftly authorized the activation of the 1st Ranger Battalion, setting in motion a rigorous, highly selective recruitment process across American encampments in Northern Ireland. The man chosen to lead this unprecedented vanguard was Major William Orlando Darby. A rugged, charismatic West Point graduate and former artillery officer, Darby possessed a ferocious inner drive and a commanding presence that immediately demanded absolute respect. Darby ruthlessly vetted thousands of volunteers from the 34th Infantry and 1st Armored Divisions. He sought a very specific psychological profile, men who possessed not only sheer physical stamina and high intelligence, but also a suppressed, ruthless aggression. He needed soldiers capable of operating in profound isolation, stripped of the massive logistical tail that defined the standard American military apparatus. The chosen few, farm boys from Iowa, steel workers from Pennsylvania, and mechanics from Brooklyn, were physically fit, but they were entirely uninitiated in the dark arts of coastal raiding. To transform these conventional troops into an elite strike force, the American command handed them over to the undisputed masters of the craft. In the miserable, perpetually damp summer of 1942, Darby's newly minted Rangers boarded steam trains and traveled deep into the forbidding, mist-shrouded Scottish Highlands. They disembarked at a remote railway station into a freezing, horizontal rain that seemed to penetrate straight to the bone. They had arrived at the doorstep of Achnacarry Castle, the ancestral stone fortress of the Clan Cameron. This sprawling, desolate estate had been entirely requisitioned by the British War Office to serve as the Commando Basic Training Center. It was an environment deliberately chosen for its relentless hostility.
The jagged peaks, the bottomless freezing lochs, and the treacherous peat bogs perfectly mirrored the unforgiving terrain of the Norwegian fjords and the heavily fortified cliffs of the Mediterranean coast. To the uninitiated American soldiers shivering on the dark platform, it looked like the desolate edge of the world. Waiting to receive them in the gloom was the formidable commandant of the training center, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan. A veteran of the bloody trenches of the First World War and the pioneering commando raids of 1940, Vaughan was a towering figure who radiated an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. He was not a diplomat sent to coddle Allied troops. He was an executioner of weakness. Vaughan made it immediately abundantly clear to Darby and his men that nationality meant absolutely nothing within the iron gates of his camp. There would be no transatlantic concessions, no relaxed standards, and certainly no American exceptionalism recognized on his training grounds. The Rangers would meet the grueling, historically unprecedented British standard of physical and psychological endurance, or they would be unceremoniously sent back to their regular infantry units in absolute disgrace. The instructors under Vaughan's command were entirely composed of combat-hardened veterans who had already bled on the beaches of occupied Europe. These British instructors understood acutely that the men of the 1st Ranger Battalion were not simply there to learn new exercises, they were there to be entirely disassembled and rebuilt. The fundamental goal of Achnacarry was to systematically strip away the soft illusions of peacetime training and brutally inoculate the human nervous system against the paralyzing terror of a chaotic, three-dimensional battlefield. The Americans had to be cured of their reliance on massed formations, heavy artillery support, and the rigidly slow, methodical pace of conventional infantry advances. Instead, they had to embrace the terrifying intimacy of the silent kill, the lethal efficiency of small unit autonomy, and the absolute necessity of striking faster than the enemy's chain of command could react. This unprecedented integration marked a pivotal moment in Allied military strategy, carrying the immense weight of the impending North African invasion on their shoulders. But forging a cohesive, lethal strike force from two distinct military cultures would not be a simple matter of shared language or common enemies.
The friction ignited almost the moment the Americans dropped their canvas duffel bags into the freezing Highland mud. The United States military in 1942 was an institution that prided itself on unparalleled logistical supremacy. An American infantryman expected a steady supply line, warm rations, and overwhelming artillery support to precede any forward movement. The British commando ethos, forged in the desperate isolation of 1940, viewed such dependencies as fatal liabilities. At Achnacarry, the Rangers were violently thrust into a world of engineered deprivation. The British instructors, hardened by the brutal realities of the Dieppe and Vagso raids, subjected the Americans to combat realism, a training philosophy that fundamentally contradicted the cautious, strictly regulated safety protocols of the standard United States Army. Live ammunition was not merely used, it was wielded as a psychological weapon against the trainees. British Bren gunners fired sustained bursts mere inches above the heads of crawling Rangers, while quarter-pound blocks of TNT were detonated without warning to simulate the concussive, disorienting shock of enemy mortar fire. For the green American farm boys, the initial reaction was a mixture of profound shock and deep resentment. They felt they were being treated not as elite volunteers, but as expendable targets by a patronizing foreign ally. This cultural resentment rapidly bled into fierce tactical disputes, most notably regarding the fundamental tools of the soldier's trade. The American Rangers arrived in Scotland clutching their modern, highly prized M1 Garand rifles.
Heavy, powerful, and capable of rapid semi-automatic fire, the Garand was designed to dominate medium-range firefights through an overwhelming volume of lead. But the commando instructors despised this reliance on noise and sustained firepower. They favored the lighter, bolt-action Lee Enfield, valuing its absolute reliability in the choking Highland mud, and emphasized the devastating, close-quarters suppressive power of the Thompson submachine gun. More importantly, the British relentlessly drilled the Americans to abandon their firearms entirely during the initial phases of a nocturnal assault. They introduced the Rangers to the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife and the garrote, forcing them to master the gruesome, intimately violent mechanics of the silent kill. The American volunteers, conditioned by conventional training to engage the enemy from a safe distance, had to overcome a profound psychological barrier. They had to learn that a single, silently slit throat in the pitch-black darkness was vastly more effective and infinitely more terrifying to the defending garrison than a deafening, premature rifle volley that would instantly betray their position. Beyond the mud and the blood, the deepest fractures threatened to split the alliance along the rigid lines of military hierarchy. The United States Army operated on a strict, highly formalized chain of command, where the distinction between commissioned officers and enlisted men was absolute and socially enforced. The British Commandos, conversely, operated as a ruthless meritocracy born of raw combat necessity. On the assault courses of Achnacarry, a combat veteran British corporal possessed the absolute, unquestioned authority to publicly berate, physically correct, and exhaustively punish an American captain if he failed to meet the uncompromising commando standard. To the American officer corps, deeply protective of their institutional dignity, this subversion of rank was intensely abrasive. Shouting matches regularly erupted in the freezing rain. Egos were brutally bruised. There were moments in those early weeks when Major Darby and Lieutenant Colonel Vaughan stood on the precipice of a total administrative collapse, as national pride and doctrinal stubbornness threatened to fracture the 1st Ranger Battalion before it ever saw combat. The grand transatlantic political alliance championed by Churchill and Roosevelt was, on the muddy ground level, fighting for its very survival. In the late summer of 1942, under the pitch-black canopy of a moonless night, the 1st Ranger Battalion launched a full-scale amphibious rehearsal against the rugged coastline of western Scotland. It was intended to be the ultimate validation of their grueling training, but it rapidly devolved into an unmitigated tactical disaster. The complex orchestration of a nocturnal assault completely unraveled in the unforgiving surf. Communication networks broke down entirely. Landing craft, piloted by inexperienced crews, drifted miles off their designated target beaches, depositing heavily laden Rangers at the base of impassable cliffs. Deprived of visual landmarks and engulfed in the terrifying confusion of the dark, the Americans instinctively reverted to their ingrained conventional infantry training. Officers began shouting orders over the roar of the waves, completely shattering the critical element of surprise. Simulated covering fire was deployed prematurely, illuminating their positions to the mock defenders. Watching from the cliffs above, the veteran British commando instructors documented the catastrophe with grim resignation. Had this exercise been the actual North African shoreline, the entire American battalion would have been systematically annihilated before they ever cleared the beachhead.
The disastrous rehearsal served as a violent, necessary awakening. In the bleak aftermath, gathered in the damp, freezing Nissen huts of Achnacarry, Major Darby confronted his humiliated men. There were no excuses offered and no blame shifted to their British counterparts. Instead, Darby relentlessly reinforced the harsh reality of their impending mission. Traditional American firepower would not save them in the shadows of Algeria. It was a crucible moment that finally shattered the lingering institutional arrogance of the American volunteers. The Rangers unequivocally realized that the brutal, seemingly excessive commando doctrine was not a British eccentricity, but the absolute, non-negotiable arithmetic of survival. The cultural and hierarchical walls finally collapsed. American officers actively sought the counsel of British enlisted veterans, eagerly absorbing the minutiae of nocturnal navigation, advanced demolitions, and stealth infiltration. The British instructors, in turn, witnessed a profound transformation. They saw the Americans channel their aggressive spirit into a cold, disciplined lethality, matching and occasionally exceeding the physical endurance records set by the commandos themselves. This profound, agonizing transformation was occurring not a moment too soon. Across the Mediterranean, the Axis defenders tasked with securing the deep-water ports of French North Africa remained entirely ignorant of the lethal hybrid force being forged in the Scottish Highlands. The strategic port of Arzew, a critical primary objective for Operation Torch, was considered virtually impregnable from the sea. Two massive coastal artillery batteries, the heavily fortified Batterie du Nord, perched on a dominating hill, and the Fort de la Pointe, dug deep into the harbor's edge, possessed overlapping fields of fire capable of pulverizing any approaching Allied invasion fleet. The German military liaisons and Vichy French commanders garrisoning these fortresses were confident in a fundamental, deeply entrenched military assumption. They believed, based on established American doctrine, that any amphibious assault would be preceded by a massive, deafening naval bombardment, providing the garrison with ample warning to man their guns and turn the beaches into a slaughterhouse. They could not possibly fathom that an Allied force possessed the capability or the sheer audacity to bypass the sea approaches entirely and strike directly from the sheer cliffs in total silence. The stakes were apocalyptic. If the massive coastal guns of Arzew were not neutralized before the main American troop transports dropped their ramps, the invasion of North Africa would drown in its own blood on the shoreline, potentially collapsing the entire Allied strategy in the Mediterranean. The 1st Ranger Battalion had successfully absorbed the ruthless infantry tactics of the British Commandos, morphing into a highly capable shock troop. However, raw, aggressive infantry skills alone were insufficient to cross an ocean and breach a fortified continent. To successfully project this newly forged weapon across the pitch-black waters of the Mediterranean, the Rangers required an even deeper, highly classified level of integration. They needed the secret, mechanized lifeblood of the British amphibious apparatus.
To deliver Major Darby's Rangers directly to the heavily fortified doorsteps of the Axis command, American military planners had to accept another bitter institutional pill. The standard American assault transports of 1942, magnificent feats of mass production though they were highly visible and largely unproven in deep stealth operations. The British, however, had spent years perfecting the Landing Craft Assault, or LCA. These lightly armored, shallow-draft vessels were specifically engineered to slip silently over treacherous, uncharted shoals in the dead of night, their specialized engines muffled to a low, practically imperceptible thrum. To utilize these vital craft, the American Rangers were forced into an intimate, high-stakes partnership with the British Royal Navy. Young, battle-hardened British coxswains, men who had navigated the perilous mine-infested waters of the English Channel, were permanently assigned to pilot the American assault teams. This meant that the lives of the entire 1st Ranger Battalion and the success of the vanguard of Operation Torch were placed unequivocally in the hands of foreign sailors. The Rangers had to learn the meticulous, silent ballet of boarding and disembarking these specific vessels in heavy seas, a physically agonizing process where a single dropped rifle or loudly shouted command could spell absolute disaster. Yet possessing the right vessels and the right infantry was meaningless without knowing precisely where the enemy was waiting in the dark. Beneath the visible layer of physical and tactical integration lay a far more secretive, profoundly sensitive foundation of Allied collaboration, the invisible war of intelligence. As American planners at Allied Force Headquarters frantically outlined the specific, highly hazardous targets along the Algerian coast, they found their own intelligence networks woefully inadequate. The United States simply had not possessed the time to build a robust espionage apparatus in French North Africa. To fill this terrifying void, the British government made a monumental, historically unprecedented decision to open its most deeply guarded vaults to the Americans. Operating from the heavily guarded, shadowed confines of Bletchley Park, brilliant British codebreakers had been painstakingly decrypting top-secret German Enigma transmissions. They intercepted vital, highly classified logistical reports detailing the exact reinforcement schedules, defensive layouts, and troop morale of the Axis forces throughout the Mediterranean.
This invaluable ultra-intelligence was seamlessly and under the strictest seal of absolute secrecy fed directly to the American assault planners. But the British intelligence contribution went far beyond intercepted radio waves. To perfectly map the treacherous, heavily mined sea approaches to the cliffs of Arzew, the British deployed their clandestine combined operations pilotage parties. These incredibly brave, solitary frogmen launched from submerged submarines in the dead of night, swimming ashore through freezing surf to physically measure the density of the sand, chart the exact location of submerged steel obstacles, and map the shifting tidal currents of the North African coast. They gathered this priceless life-or-death data right under the noses of Vichy French sentries, bringing it back to the Allied command. Armed with this meticulously gathered British intelligence, the Rangers utilized captured terrain in Scotland to construct full-scale, exact physical replicas of the Algerian coastal batteries they were slated to destroy. Day after day, week after week, under the watchful, ruthlessly critical eyes of their British commando instructors and Royal Navy coxswains, the Americans assaulted these mock-ups using live ammunition. They relentlessly rehearsed every single terrifying minute of the impending invasion. They applied the harsh lessons learned from their disastrous first rehearsal, replacing shouted orders with a complex system of silent hand signals and specialized low-visibility flashlights. The initial animosity that had poisoned the camp at Achnacarry evaporated, replaced by a profound, battle-forged brotherhood born of shared misery and absolute mutual reliance. American farm boys and British sailors were no longer just allies on paper. They had become a singular, highly integrated, lethal mechanism. But as the autumn leaves began to fall in Scotland, the time for rehearsals abruptly ran out. The massive, sprawling armada of Operation Torch was finally assembling in the grey waters of the Atlantic, preparing to plunge into the unknown. The ultimate validation of this unprecedented transatlantic experiment was no longer a theory, it was a looming, terrifying reality.
In late October 1942, this highly lethal, meticulously integrated hybrid force finally boarded the transport ships, vanishing into the sprawling expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The sheer scale of the Operation Torch Armada was staggering, a vast mechanized steel forest stretching from horizon to horizon, carrying the hopes of the free world toward the Mediterranean.
For the men of the 1st Ranger Battalion, however, their universe instantly shrank to the suffocating, claustrophobic confines of British troop ships. Deep within the vibrating steel bellies of these vessels, the final, most profound phase of their transatlantic integration occurred. Forced into incredibly tight quarters for weeks on end, the American soldiers and the British Royal Navy crews who would pilot them into the crossfire forged a bond born of absolute, terrifying interdependence. The cultural friction that had once ignited shouting matches in the Scottish mud was entirely extinguished, replaced by a grim, unspoken understanding. The young British coxswains knew they were tasked with delivering the Americans directly into the jaws of Axis artillery, and the Rangers knew their survival depended entirely on the steady hands of these foreign sailors navigating the treacherous, uncharted shoals of the African coast. As the Armada relentlessly battered its way southward, plunging through violently churning autumn swells, the Rangers utilized every agonizing hour to obsessively refine the dark arts they had acquired at Achnacarry. In the cramped, sweltering holds of the transport ships, the scent of canvas, machine oil, and anxious sweat hung heavy in the recycled air. Here, the specialized tools of the British Commando were painstakingly adapted for the specific, unforgiving terrain of the Algerian coastline. American soldiers sat cross-legged on the cold steel decking, rhythmically drawing whetstones across the blackened blades of their fighting knives until the edges were razor-sharp, preparing for the intimate, silent violence that awaited them. They relentlessly field-stripped their Thompson submachine guns blindfolded, ensuring flawless muscle memory in the pitch-black conditions they were about to encounter. Using the priceless, highly classified topographical intelligence gathered by British frogmen and Bletchley Park codebreakers, Ranger officers constructed elaborate, three-dimensional sand table models of the Arzew defenses right on the deck plates. Every squad leader was forced to memorize the precise location of every known Vichy French machine gun nest and the exact elevation of the massive coastal guns, ensuring that if the chain of command was shattered, every surviving Ranger knew exactly how to execute the mission autonomously. This relentless, obsessive preparation was an absolute necessity, for the psychological burden resting on the shoulders of the 1st Ranger Battalion was almost incomprehensible. Major Darby constantly paced the narrow passageways, studying the shifting weather reports and the final intelligence decrypts, acutely aware that his men were no longer conventional infantrymen. They had been entirely transformed into a specialized surgical instrument, but it was an instrument that had never been tested in the fires of a full-scale invasion. The commando doctrine hammered into them dictated that they operate in the absolute vanguard, entirely cut off from the massive logistical support network and overwhelming covering fire that defined the traditional American way of war. If the British intelligence was flawed, if the Royal Navy coxswains missed the designated landing zones in the dark, or if the Rangers themselves failed to execute the silent infiltration flawlessly, there would be no rescue. They would be systematically annihilated on the jagged rocks of Arzew, and the sprawling American invasion fleet trailing closely behind them would sail blindly into a devastating, high-explosive slaughter. The agonizing period of anticipation finally shattered on the starless, moonless night of November 8, 1942. The massive Allied armada slipped silently through the Straits of Gibraltar, entering the unpredictable waters of the Mediterranean Sea. As the transport ships crawled to a halt miles off the coast of Algeria, a chilling silence fell over the fleet. The time for rehearsals, cultural debates, and transatlantic diplomacy was over. Heavy winches groaned in the darkness as the specialized British landing craft assault vessels were swung out over the black, swelling void. The American Rangers, faces blackened with cork and heavy with explosives, silently stepped over the rails and descended into the violently pitching craft, placing their lives entirely in the hands of the British sailors gripping the helms. The low, muffled thrum of the LCA engines roared to life, fighting against the heavy chop of the sea. They were turning to a hostile, heavily fortified continent, attempting a feat of amphibious stealth that the Axis command believed was absolutely impossible. The phantom force was finally off the leash, but what awaited them in the black heights of Arzew would test the very limits of human endurance.
The final approach to the Algerian coast was a masterclass in the very stealth and precision the American Rangers had bled to acquire in Scotland. As the specialized British landing craft assault vessels carved through the dark, choppy waters of the Mediterranean, the terrifying reality of their isolation set in. There was no deafening preparatory naval bombardment to shatter the nerves of the defenders. There was no massive air armada droning overhead. There was only the freezing sea spray, the muffled, rhythmic thrum of the boat engines, and the oppressive, suffocating darkness. The young British Royal Navy coxswains, peering through the salt-streaked gloom, executed their navigational duties with a flawless, ice-cold perfection. Bypassing the heavily mined primary beaches, where the Axis commanders expected a conventional landing, the British sailors threaded the needle, piloting the flat-bottomed craft directly toward a series of treacherous rocky coves nestled at the very base of the Arzew cliffs. As the steel ramps lowered onto the jagged shingle, the transition from sea to land was eerily soundless. There were no shouted commands, no clattering of dropped rifles, and no chaotic splashing. The Rangers poured out of the craft like phantoms, utilizing the complex system of silent hand signals and low-visibility red flashlights they had relentlessly drilled at Achnacarry, immediately melting into the shadows of the African continent. Once ashore, Major Darby immediately fractured his small, highly mobile force into two distinct assault elements, executing a complex tactical maneuver designed to simultaneously decapitate the Arzew defenses. The primary element, led by Darby himself, hooked toward the harbor to neutralize Fort de la Pointe, a heavily fortified installation guarding the immediate sea approaches. The second element, commanded by Captain Roy Murray, faced a vastly more physically punishing objective. Their target was the Batterie du Nord, the sprawling, heavily reinforced concrete artillery complex perched aggressively atop a commanding hill overlooking the entire coastal plain. To reach these massive guns, Murray's men had to execute a grueling, near-vertical climb up a crumbling, goat-path-strewn ravine in pitch blackness. This was the exact scenario the agonizing Scottish death rides and cliff-scaling drills had been designed for. Carrying heavy Thompson submachine guns, specialized demolition charges, and coiled toggle ropes, the Americans ascended the steep, treacherous incline with a silent, terrifying agility that would have been entirely impossible for standard, heavily burdened infantry. They bypassed the deeply entrenched forward listening posts, moving vertically through the Axis defensive network's most glaring blind spot. As the vanguard of Captain Murray's element breached the perimeter of the upper battery, the fundamental arrogance of the Axis defensive strategy was violently exposed. The Vichy French and German liaison officers garrisoning the Batterie du Nord were entirely relaxed, their attention fixed firmly on the distant, empty sea, waiting for the massive telltale flashes of an Allied naval bombardment that would signal an impending invasion. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the vanguard of the American army was already inside their wire. Employing the ruthless close-quarters assassination techniques perfected under the critical eyes of British instructors, the Rangers initiated a systematic, silent slaughter. Moving in autonomous, highly synchronized two-man teams, they slipped through the shadows of the concrete casements.
Sentries were eliminated with brutal, breathless efficiency, using the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife and the garrote. The Axis garrison began to slowly, confusedly bleed to death from within. Commanders attempting to radio the lower fort found their communication lines already expertly severed. The phantom force doctrine had been executed with such chilling perfection that the defenders were being neutralized before they even realized the battle had begun. Simultaneously, at the base of the cliffs, Major Darby's assault team was methodically dismantling the perimeter defenses of Fort de la Pointe. Slipping through the jagged rocks and barbed wire, the Americans utilized the specialized Bangalore torpedoes acquired from the British to silently breach the outer concertina webs. But as the Rangers swarmed into the lower courtyard of the fortress, preparing to storm the main barracks and silence the guns, the fragile veil of absolute secrecy was violently torn away. An alert Axis sentry, noticing a fleeting shadow against the concrete, panicked and fired his weapon into the dark, immediately followed by the blinding, hissing arc of a magnesium illumination flare. The pitch-black courtyard was instantly bathed in a stark, harsh white light, exposing dozens of American Rangers caught out in the open. The deafening blare of klaxon alarms shattered the Mediterranean night. In the upper casements of the fort, Axis gunners desperately scrambled from their bunks, violently cranking the heavy iron elevation wheels of their massive coastal artillery pieces, lowering the long, lethal barrels to fire plank-blank into the American assault teams trapped in the courtyard below.
The blinding magnesium flare should have spelled the total annihilation of Darby's assault element. In a conventional infantry scenario, the sudden, terrifying exposure and the mechanical grinding of the heavy artillery barrels lowering toward them would have triggered widespread panic and a disorganized retreat. But the Rangers did not retreat. They accelerated. Relying entirely on the hyper-aggressive, close-quarters combat conditioning hammered into them at Achnacarry, they charged directly into the blinding light. Abandoning stealth, they unleashed a devastating, concentrated volume of fire from their Thompson submachine guns, sweeping the upper parapets and pinning the Axis gunners down before they could fully depress the massive artillery pieces. Small autonomous Ranger teams splintered off, kicking in the wooden doors of the barracks and clearing the confined spaces with grenades and rapid, brutal efficiency. Within a matter of chaotic, blood-soaked minutes, the vicious shock assault overwhelmed the deeply confused Vichy French garrison, securing Fort de la Pointe and silencing the lower battery before it could fire a single catastrophic shell into the American troop transports massing offshore. High above this chaotic firefight at the sprawling Batterie du Nord complex, Captain Murray's Rangers were simultaneously executing the final, lethal phase of their infiltration. The distant blare of the klaxon alarms from the lower fort shattered the silence on the hill, instantly alerting the remaining Axis defenders to the profound breach in their perimeter. But the warning came far too late. The Rangers were already inside the concrete artillery emplacements. As the German and Vichy French officers frantically attempted to organize a coherent counterattack, they were met with a terrifying, highly localized violence they could not comprehend. The attackers moved with the fluid, phantom-like speed of British commandos, utilizing captured Axis weaponry and lethal hand-to-hand techniques, yet they were shouting commands in distinctly American accents. This profound cognitive dissonance paralyzed the Axis command structure. German intelligence officers monitoring the chaotic radio transmissions from the dying fortresses were completely baffled. They could not reconcile the aggressive, specialized raiding tactics unfolding before them with their deeply ingrained dismissive assessment of the conventional American military machine. Capitalizing on this paralyzing confusion, Murray's men surged into the primary gun pits. Their primary objective was not merely to kill the defenders, but to ensure the massive 105mm coastal guns could never be fired at the approaching Allied fleet.
Utilizing specialized thermite charges and sledgehammers, the Rangers systematically destroyed the intricate breech blocks and smashed the delicate firing mechanisms of the heavy artillery. The intense heat of the thermite fused the hardened steel gears, permanently transforming the terrifying Axis coastal battery into a collection of useless, smoking scrap metal. As the first pale gray streaks of dawn began to illuminate the jagged Algerian coastline, the sheer magnitude of the Rangers' triumph became undeniably clear. In less than 3 hours, utilizing absolute stealth, profound physical endurance, and concentrated shock violence, a single, highly specialized American battalion had completely dismantled an impregnable fortress network that was expected to require days of heavy naval bombardment and thousands of infantry casualties to secure. From the commanding, smoke-choked heights of the captured Batterie du Nord, the exhausted, bloodied Rangers looked out over the vast expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. The horizon, previously an empty black void, was now completely filled with the colossal, mechanized silhouette of the Allied invasion armada. Hundreds of heavily laden troop transports and massive naval cruisers were steaming confidently toward the Arzew beaches, completely unmolested by the heavy coastal artillery that was supposed to turn the surf into a slaughterhouse. Major Darby fired a designated sequence of green flares into the dawn sky, signaling to the anxious naval commanders offshore that the guns were silenced and the beaches were secure. The incredibly desperate, historically unprecedented transatlantic gamble had worked with a terrifying, flawless precision. The phantom force forged in the freezing mud of Scotland had successfully paved the way for the liberation of North Africa. But the strategic ramifications of this localized slaughter would soon echo far beyond the shattered concrete of Arzew, completely rewriting the operational doctrine of the entire Second World War.
The silencing of the Batterie du Nord and Fort de la Pointe fundamentally altered the trajectory of Operation Torch. As the morning sun burned off the dense Mediterranean mist, the massive troop ships of the American Armada steamed completely unopposed into the deep-water harbor of Arzew. Tens of thousands of conventional American infantrymen from the famed 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, poured onto the beaches without facing the catastrophic, high-explosive slaughter that had haunted Allied planners for months. The operational success was absolute, and the cost was astonishingly low. Major Darby's Rangers had suffered only a handful of casualties, while capturing hundreds of Axis prisoners and neutralizing the primary existential threat to the invasion fleet. The daring nocturnal raid proved conclusively that heavily defended coastal choke points could be surgically removed by specialized, lightly armed infantry moving rapidly under the cover of darkness. The localized slaughter at Arzew was a strategic masterstroke that rippled across the entire operational theater. The Axis High Command, deeply arrogant in their dismissal of American tactical capability, was violently jolted by the realization that a new, terrifyingly capable hybrid force had entered the Mediterranean theater. The staggering triumph at Arzew served as the ultimate, irrefutable vindication of Major General Lucian Truscott's radical transatlantic gamble. The profound institutional friction that had nearly derailed the training camps at Achnacarry Castle was entirely forgotten, replaced by a deep, enduring paradigm shift within the highest echelons of the Allied command. The American military apparatus, previously rigidly bound to doctrines of overwhelming mass and sustained artillery barrages, immediately recognized the indispensable value of the commando ethos. Furthermore, the flawless execution of the Arzew assault definitively validated the unprecedented integration of specialized British technology and intelligence. The silent, shallow-draft landing craft assault vessels, expertly navigated by British Royal Navy coxswains, were permanently adopted as the gold standard for American amphibious infiltrations. The seamless pipeline of highly classified ultra-intelligence from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, combined with the incredibly detailed topographical maps gathered by British frogmen, established a permanent life-saving blueprint for all future joint operations intelligence sharing. This was no longer a theoretical military exercise. It was a battle-proven doctrine demonstrating that transatlantic cooperation could dismantle the most heavily fortified positions on Earth. The psychological impact of the Ranger assaults injected a deep, paralyzing uncertainty into the Axis defensive posture across North Africa. German intelligence networks scrambled to comprehend the nature of this new American unit that fought with the terrifying localized violence of their most hated British adversaries. Intercepted German communications revealed a growing, palpable dread of these specialized American pathfinders who moved through the darkness and fought with unconventional ruthlessness. The successful Allied lodgment in Algeria and Morocco fundamentally shifted the strategic geometry of the entire war. General Erwin Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps, previously driving relentlessly eastward toward the Suez Canal, suddenly found itself trapped in a colossal, crushing strategic vice. Pressed by General Bernard Montgomery's resurgent British Eighth Army from the east, and now threatened by the rapidly expanding American and British forces pushing from the west, the Axis hold on the continent began to fatally crumble. The Rangers had not merely secured a harbor, they had violently kicked open the back door to North Africa, initiating a grueling campaign that would ultimately drive the Axis forces into the sea. Beyond the blood-soaked sands of the Mediterranean, the legacy of this initial U.S.-British collaboration became the foundational architecture for the eventual liberation of Western Europe. Recognizing that a single battalion of elite shock troops was insufficient for the colossal campaigns looming on the horizon, the American High Command immediately authorized a massive expansion of the Ranger Force. Drawing directly upon the brutal, battle-proven curriculum established by the British Commandos at Achnacarry Castle, new Ranger battalions were forged and thrust into the vanguard of the Allied advance. The lethal, stealth-oriented tactics perfected in the shadows of Algeria were subsequently deployed across the jagged cliffs of Sicily during Operation Husky, the bloody, grinding mountains of the Italian peninsula, and ultimately the devastating crucible of the Normandy landings. The men who would eventually scale the impossible heights of Pointe du Hoc on D-Day owed their survival, their specialized equipment, and their ruthless operational doctrine entirely to the profound brotherhood forged in the darkness of Arzew.
Had this unprecedented transatlantic gamble collapsed in the freezing mud of Achnacarry, or had institutional arrogance blinded the Allied command to the necessity of combined operations, the grim calculus of the Second World War would have undoubtedly shifted toward catastrophic failure. The survival of the sprawling invasion fleet off the coast of Arzew hung by a terrifyingly thin thread, secured entirely by the localized, hyper-aggressive initiative of a few isolated men who had been meticulously trained to think and strike like British commandos. If that thread had snapped, the invasion of North Africa could have been violently repulsed back into the Mediterranean, irrevocably altering the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century and condemning millions to continued fascist occupation. Instead, the undeniable, blood-soaked triumph of this transatlantic brotherhood cemented a permanent, radical evolution in global military architecture that extends far beyond the mid-20th century. The fading echoes of Achnacarry Castle and the shattered concrete of the Batterie du Nord continue to resonate profoundly within the DNA of every modern special operations command functioning today. The fundamental, uncompromising principles ruthlessly hammered into those young American volunteers by their battle-hardened British mentors, strict small-unit autonomy, the absolute necessity of joint intelligence sharing, and the seamless, frictionless interoperability of multinational forces became the undisputed bedrock of post-war Western military doctrine. When modern United States Army Special Forces, elite Navy SEALs, or British Special Air Service operators deploy silently into the world's most hostile, unforgiving environments, they are actively utilizing the direct, tactical descendants of the very infiltration techniques, close-quarters combat philosophies, and joint service logistical networks pioneered in the desperate darkness of 1942. The foundational concept of the modern Allied Joint Task Force, seamlessly blending the unique capabilities of different sovereign nations into a single, devastatingly effective spearhead, was quite literally born in the freezing mud of Scotland and baptized in the chaotic surf of North Africa. The intertwined saga of the American Rangers and the British Commandos stands as vastly more than a mere historical footnote of strategic coordination. It remains the ultimate masterclass in the lethal pragmatism of human survival. It serves as an enduring testament to the fact that when rigid national dogma is willingly stripped away, and ordinary men from opposite sides of an ocean are united by a singular, ruthless purpose, the impossible simply becomes the next tactical objective. In the pitch-black dawn of November 8, 1942, these men did not conquer the heights of Arzew as divided allies. They fought and bled as a single, unstoppable blade drawn directly against the throat of tyranny, proving to history that the deadliest, most decisive weapon in any arsenal will always be the unbroken alliance of courageous men.